interactive. We want this to be really interactive. So please be ready to participate. But before we go further, let us ground ourselves into this session. We've chosen karakia that is specifically has the intention of bringing calm, thinking about a reset of energy, inviting peace, and settling ourselves in for a conversation. So this seemed to be a very fitting one. So please, if you want to join in with me, whakataka te hou ki te uru, whakataka te hou ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, tihe, mauriora. I do like that karakia. I understand it's slightly controversial in terms of the origin or the actual story behind it, and that may be a good setting then for our conversation today. We have three perfectly qualified experts to guide us through this conversation. We're really pleased to welcome back Jonathan Boston, the Emeritus Professor of Public Policy at Victoria University of Wellington and a prominent figure in New Zealand's policy landscape. He's served on the expert working group on managed retreat with a focus on policy issues and options for funding public compensation schemes for private property losses caused by climate change. So that's a perfect qualification. And he's an advocate for tackling short-termism in democratic policy making through more cross-party consensus and long-term strategy addressing social and environmental challenges, which again, I think is going to serve us well in the conversation today. So welcome, Jonathan. Jonathan will be followed by Katherine, who's a prominent water and resilience engineer and a climate change consultant at Tonkin and Taylor. And Katherine specialises in supporting the water sector and local government to adapt to the impacts of climate change. Katherine's going to give us a bit of a foray into the work that's been going on in South Dunedin with some practical lessons from the field and insights that can help guide us forwards. And that leads us perfectly into the conversation that James Hughes will lead. And many of you will know that he's a well-known climate adaptation specialist and the technical director for climate and resilience at Tonkin and Taylor. His areas of expertise cover climate change risk assessments, infrastructure resilience, adaptation planning, and integrated solutions for a climate changed future. And I'm your host for today, Simon Harvey. I'm a strategic sustainability specialist. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation. We are having some polls today because we really want to know what you think and get some information from you. And we're going to start off with one just to get a sense that might then help inform our presenters, and where they have some discretion to add some content, they can try and line it up with what you want. Siobhan is going to help us run those. So Siobhan is our technical expert today behind the scenes. And this is the opening question. The polls will happen in the chat of the Teams call. Hopefully we'll all have access to that. So Siobhan, perhaps just launch this first opening question in the polls, and let's see what people are particularly interested in learning about at today's session.
I think that one's been ongoing there, Simon. It's come up
Right.
in mine already.
That's good. Yeah. This is the problem. We're trying to have too many things open. So let's invite people to jump into that. I get to choose as well. Do we get to see the results? Let me just see. Here we go. Just feeding through. That's good. We've got all of the above seem to be working, which is great. I think we should be able to cater to that. So without any further ado, it is time to Jonathan to jump to your presentation. So welcome, Jonathan. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Simon, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. Thank you to Katherine and James and Siobhan for helping to set this up. So in the brief time I've got available, I wanted to cover the key elements of the National Adaptation Framework that was announced by the government last month, I should say, its key strengths and weaknesses, and present just some elements of an alternative and arguably better framework. As you'll be aware, we've had many reports dealing with adaptation issues over a number of years, but probably fewer important decisions. And yet we face ever-increasing risks, particularly climate intensified risks. So many of you will have read some or all of these reports, and of course, this is just a small part of the documentation that's available. Next slide, Simon. Thank you. So by way of a quick overview, as most of you will be aware, the National Adaptation Framework released last month sets out some goals and principles and 4 pillars. In terms of the goals and principles, key ones include minimising long-term net costs to society of climate-driven natural hazards, minimising fiscal costs, providing better information, enhancing resilience, and so forth. And there are 4 key pillars in the new framework. The first is to enhance the quality of information available. The second is to improve local government planning for adaptation. The third is to provide a framework for investing in risk reduction, particularly in terms of protective structures. And the fourth is to provide a framework for cost sharing for both pre and post natural hazard events in the future. And in relation to that last pillar, the government is yet to make key decisions. Indeed, it's announced that it won't be making key decisions until after the next election. Next slide, please, Simon. So as we think about the new framework, there's, in my view, some very positive elements, and there's some less positive elements. On the positive side, the commitment to minimising net long-term societal costs, I think, is highly desirable. It's something that Judy Lawrence and I have advocated for almost a decade, and the focus there being on long-term societal costs as opposed to fiscal costs, I think, is highly significant. We should be concerned about society as a whole, not just fiscal aggregates. Secondly, there's clearly an emphasis on providing better, more robust, more consistent risk information, including really good national flood maps and so forth, and that, in my view, makes sense. Third, the government is committed to better land use planning with more powers for local government and measures to try and reduce some of the litigation risks that local government might face. And again, I think that's very positive. And fourthly, the government has kept open the possibility of building a cross-party consensus on its framework, particularly in relation to cost sharing. And I think that's desirable, though I'd have to say to date, the emphasis on cross-party consensus building has not been huge. However, having said that, it seems to me the current framework in its incomplete and possibly in its more complete state raises lots of concerns. And I'd just like to run through some of those with you. In very broad terms, it seems to me that the new framework doesn't take seriously or adequately the magnitude and unprecedented nature of the climate-related risks that New Zealand will face over the coming decades and beyond, and thus the need for transformative, ongoing adaptation. My sense is that there is still an unwillingness to accept that we face an extraordinary and unusual, unparalleled nature of risk. And until we accept that, I don't think we're going to make the kind of progress we need. The second is that there's little evidence in the documentation that the government has provided, including the work of the independent reference group upon which the government's framework is at least partially based, very little evidence that much attention has been given to international evidence. And that includes the work of a number of countries which have been focused on the very same issues that we are, such as France and Switzerland, which have both got rather more comprehensive and integrated frameworks for the provision of information, land use planning, proactive adaptation, and so forth. So a bit disappointing, but not necessarily surprising. But probably the more significant issues relate to the significant policy gaps in the new adaptation framework. And let me mention a few of those. First of all, as indicated, there's no framework yet for cost sharing. And until we have a clear framework for cost sharing, including how we're going to pay for the relocation of potentially tens of thousands of people over the coming decades, then obviously this framework will remain incomplete. Secondly, there's clearly an intention to transition to some new framework, but the transitional arrangements are unclear. And again, until those are clarified, the framework will be imperfect. Third, one of the striking features of the new framework is that it mentions geophysical hazards hardly at all. So it's not clear whether there is an intention to have different policy frameworks for the handling of geophysical hazards as opposed to climate-related hazards. And my sense is that it would be rather difficult politically to have completely different frameworks. So, for example, if we had another kind of Christchurch event, would we not have any capacity to engage in significant property buyouts of red zone properties or not? I just don't think it's going to be tenable politically to have really difficult, really different policy frameworks in place, particularly given the sorts of stakes that are at play. And then finally, in terms of gaps, the government is clearly wanting to change people's expectations about the extent to which the state will intervene to help them, and particularly to undertake property buyouts in the event of a disaster. But my concern is that if you're going to change expectations significantly, then you will need some kind of cross-party agreement. Otherwise, people won't accept the framework as being credible. And indeed, there's a significant risk, if there isn't a cross-party agreement, that you'll have inconsistent and unstable policy settings as governments come and go. So in other words, we'll have dynamic inconsistency or time inconsistency, and that will not be good from the point of view of intergenerational justice and many other things. Another key concern relates to the behavioural assumptions upon which the National Adaptation Framework is based. And let me just mention a few. There seems to be an assumption that human behaviour is generally rational, that if you provide robust risk information, people will make prudent investment decisions, that if you have risk-based insurance premiums, they will drive property markets and ensure that they adjust efficiently and effectively in the face of changing risk profiles, and that all this combined will ensure that we somehow reduce and mitigate risks and enhance societal resilience. But in my view, all these assumptions are open to question. Very quickly, in terms of rationality, there is a huge amount of social science evidence indicating that people suffer from all manner of cognitive biases: myopia, status quo bias, optimism bias, normalcy bias, overconfidence bias, and many other biases, and that these biases affect decision-making. Secondly, it's pretty clear, again, from the social science evidence, that people don't always make good use of risk information. Indeed, people often have a very poor understanding of risk, particularly risks of the kind that we face over the coming decades and beyond, risks that are relatively infrequent and unusual. Many other factors tend to influence behavior other than people's risk assessments. Third point is that risk-based premiums don't necessarily affect property markets in the way that it seems to be assumed by the government. There's a huge amount of evidence here that, in fact, risks only affect property markets to a modest extent. In other words, there's a significant amount of misinformation, inertia, and so on affecting market prices. Moreover, the evidence also suggests that while markets may respond after a major disaster, the effect on property prices is frequently temporary, maybe only 18 months or 2 years. Some work was done in Dunedin after the floods in Dunedin in 2015, which just highlight again the kind of short memories that people tend to have, and hence the fact that markets don't necessarily adequately reflect the risks that they face. Finally, we mustn't ignore the fact that people's choices are highly constrained, often by very significant financial limitations. So even if people are well-informed and rational, they may not be able to act on those well-informed, rational decisions or preferences. They may simply lack the means to move. They may be stuck in what has been called property purgatory. And unless the helping hand of the state is there to help people actually undertake risk mitigation and risk reduction activities, they may not be able to do very much. Simply having risk-based premiums won't solve the problem, and indeed it may in some cases intensify the problem by reducing insurance coverage, which will reduce resilience, and by enhancing socioeconomic inequalities. Finally, I have a raft of ethical concerns in relation to the current national policy framework. And again, just briefly, a few of those. So first of all, although the emphasis in the report is on minimizing net long-term societal risks, it seems to me, or costs, it seems to me that the primary emphasis is reducing short-term fiscal costs. But that, in my view, is not a highly desirable goal. We should be focused on the societal level on the long term, not on short-term fiscal considerations. To be sure, we need to use the resources we have available efficiently and effectively, but sometimes investing now will help reduce long-term risks and vulnerabilities significantly, and thus save a lot of money and possibly human lives in the future. Secondly, there's no emphasis on the principle of precaution. So no emphasis on proactive retreat or relocation of properties. And third, there's a pretty limited conception of fairness underpinning the government's approach. It has a strong emphasis on the beneficiary pays principle, but that is just one of many principles of fairness. It's not always a principle that's particularly relevant in specific policy terms, and it's not always clear who the beneficiaries are. So when we come to the issue of situations where planned relocation may be the only cost-effective solution to a particular set of risks, well, who are the beneficiaries of that? How do we decide? And will the beneficiaries, in fact, be in a position to pay if, in fact, they're obliged to pay? So that all leads to a whole lot of other questions about the kind of society we want, the extent to which we see, for example, property insurance as a social good and a merit good, something to be encouraged and supported, and indeed in some cases subsidized in the interest of long-term societal and economic resilience. Next slide, please.
Jonathan, we're down to the last minute,
yes,
minute or
sure.
so.
Okay. So, in a nutshell, if my critique is correct, then it seems to me the new framework suffers from a multiplicity of risks. And we run the risk of having poor implementation, less societal resilience, increased inequality, greater fiscal risks, and policy instability. Next slide, and I'll just quickly comment on this next slide, Simon. So in terms of setting up an alternative approach, I suppose I could just really refer people to the expert working group on managed retreat, which sought to provide in considerable detail the kind of framework that we need. One that is evidence-informed, that has solid ethical foundations, sensible behavioral assumptions, that recognizes the vital role of the state to mitigate and manage unprecedented and unmanageable risks or uninsurable risks. It emphasized the precautionary approach. It emphasized the need for an integrated approach to policymaking and the need for cross-party support and consensus in the interests of credibility and durability. So that's a quick nutshell, a quick take on the current framework and a very brief suggestion of an alternative approach. Thanks, Simon.
Fantastic. No, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. We are going to move to some questions in one moment. Before we do that, we're just going to grab a pulse of the group, and we've got another couple of polls which Siobhan will launch. I'm just going to put them up on the screen so you can have a little read if the chat is a little more constrained, and then jump into that poll and let's see what you think. Okay, we've got some answers coming through.
I think, Simon, because they were in short succession, people might have only managed the.
Yeah,
Well, maybe not.
There's two there for people to go. I'm just looking at how they've come up on in the chat just to try and keep up with other people. While those come through, let's jump to a few questions. We've got a few minutes for some questions with Jonathan, which is a unique and great opportunity. And I saw that Alison asked a question in the chat, Jonathan. So let's jump to that one first. Alison, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself, if you're happy to do so?
That's a bit of a funny question. If I can find it. Basically, I said, how much further does the NAF move us forward beyond what the NAP already set out? I feel like this was all already signaled to some extent, and it didn't make very much positive progress.
So the difference between the framework and the plan that had already been set out is, I think, the question there, isn't it, Alison?
Yeah.
The NAF and the NAP.
So in terms of the difference between the NAP and the previous, the National Adaptation Framework compared with the National Adaptation Plan, not much progress, I would have said. Some signalling of a new direction, particularly in terms of a reduction in the state's role as a funder of some kinds of adaptation, particularly planned relocation and property buyouts. But that signalling, of course, is yet to be kind of transformed into concrete policy substance. So yes, not a great deal of progress, but that's been I'm afraid, the pattern now for some considerable time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Let's jump to the next question. Greg, I think, Greg Stevens is the next question. Greg, would you like to jump on and ask your question? Are you there? Or I can ask it, which I think says, Jonathan, when the bill is released, is there any likelihood that you can provide your submission on it out early to the local government sector so we can use some of your critiques for our submissions?
Well, I'm happy to make whatever I write available to anyone who's interested, and if it is useful, all well and good. Yeah, short answer, yes.
Fantastic. Let's see, who else have we got there? Jonathan, we've got a question from Fiona McDonald, I think, there about the limitations of the framework. Fiona, would you like to ask the question?
Sure, kia ora, Jonathan. Given all the limitations that you just outlined, if you were wearing my hat, for example, if you were in local government, what would be the top thing you would be doing to set your community up for the future? It's a hard question.
Fiona, look, I don't know if there's any one thing, and I think it would depend a little bit on which part of the country one was in, and the various, the stage in any process of planning that you might be involved in. I think if I was to speak kind of for local government as a whole, I think local government needs to make it very, very clear to the government that any effective long-term policy which is going to minimize the damage we might suffer from various natural hazards in the future, particularly climate intensified risks, and enhance overall economic and societal resilience. I think it's really important that the message gets through to the government that the policy needs to be based on the best available evidence, including international evidence, that it needs to be based on realistic behavioral assumptions, needs to take very seriously the limitations that many property owners have in terms of their actual capacity to enhance the resilience of their properties, let alone move in the face of very high levels of risk. So a very strong emphasis, it seems to me, needs to be made on critical bits of evidence about the nature of the real world, rather than some, if you like, ideologically driven world that some people seem to inhabit, but seems to be a long way from reality.
Thank you, Jonathan. There we go. Now we've got a tricky question here from Donovan, who put a comment in the thread a little earlier on. Jonathan, do you want to jump on and ask your question as succinctly as we can?
Yeah, g'day from in Belém at the moment, timely. My question was, trust and adaptation requires that institutional continuity, right? And do you think adaptation framework, do you think it can be credible with the supporting climate architecture at the moment that's just being dismantled?
Well, I think what the government is doing in relation to climate change mitigation will clearly be, in broad terms, undermining confidence in the government's commitment to addressing climate change more generally, including adaptation. So, to what extent is open to debate, but I do think we are in a context where we appear to have a government that really is not taking climate change particularly seriously, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, but is also signalling, I think, for sort of broad philosophical or ideological reasons, that much of the burden of adjustment that's going to be needed is going to have to be borne by non-state players, property owners particularly, whether they're businesses or residential property owners. And my concern in all this will be that a diminution in the role of the state, and in particular a failure to adjust policy settings to recognize the intensified risk environment we face, that will ultimately be highly injurious to the country's economic, social and environmental future. It will reduce societal resilience. It will increase long-term fiscal costs. It will ensure we suffer more damage than is necessary. That's my fear. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my take on things.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So I'm very disappointed indeed with the government's backtracking over almost 2 years now on the mitigation side, and the very limited progress we've made on adaptation.
So there's another question here, I think, and a lot of this obviously hinges around the credibility of the democratic system and its ability to cater for these complex issues. Richard Milnes asked an interesting question. Richard, if you're still online, would you like to ask that question yourself? And if not, I will ask it. Jonathan, will a focus on adaptation take away from policy development and finance for mitigation, putting a bucket under the hole in the roof, giving government an excuse for further delays? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess that is a risk, but frankly, in my view, we need to be applying our minds and the best kind of policy tools that we've got available to both mitigation and adaptation. The mitigation challenge is obviously absolutely urgent, but so too is the adaptation challenge. They're not mutually exclusive. Obviously, we need to ensure that as we adapt, we minimize emissions as we go, but both tasks are, in my view, imperative, and then they shouldn't be thought of as somehow alternatives or ones to be traded off. We must do both, and do both with urgency, but also with intelligence and commitment to cost-effective, equitable, and effective interventions.
Thank you. And that sounds like it's been a theme for much of your work over the years. We've got one more question here in the chat. Let's just take that one, and that'll be perfect timing for us to move on. I think this is an interesting one. You talked about the evidence of how risk assessment can affect market factors. We've got a question here from Jasmine. Jasmine, would you like to jump on and just ask that question?
Sure. I might not switch on my camera, but happy to,
okay.
Excuse me, talk to it. So I suppose you did mention that we aren't necessarily rational beings. Our home decisions might be driven emotionally or other factors. But how do we start to kickstart that behavioral change where we can make buyers not so much make buyers, but help buyers understand climate risks and start that conversation going? Because other than if we're going to buyers beware and the those who the ownership, I'm losing my train of thought here. Basically, how do we kickstart behavioral change where people understand the level of risk that they're buying into?
Right. So
Thank you, Desmond.
it's a very good question, and it's a complex one, and I'll be brief. I don't want to argue that prices don't matter at all. My fundamental point, however, is that the price mechanisms, particularly in relation to responding to risks of various kinds, that relying on price mechanisms on property markets to adjust and so on, it's not going to be adequate in the face of the kinds of risks we face for the sorts of reasons that I've set out and drawing on the kind of evidence we already have. I mean, if you look at just one example, the state of Florida, vast numbers of people have moved into Florida over the last few decades, including into areas that are at high risk of sea level rise and hurricanes. And that's despite all the evidence that's available that it's not sensible to be moving into these parts of Florida. So just providing people with information and also relying on insurance premium signals to indicate the level of risk, it's clear that that's not enough. And indeed, there are all kinds of equity issues that arise too. We face an increasing prospect if we do rely primarily on risk-based premiums, for example, to drive property markets and then to drive adaptation responses. If we do that, we're likely to end up with reduced insurance coverage, increased inequality in coverage, increased underinsurance, and thus increased risk to the society as a whole when we do have major natural hazard events. And then we'll have a much longer recovery process as a result of that, with higher economic costs, higher fiscal costs, and so on. So my key point is we need to do a battery of things. Prices have their role, but they must not be relied on as the primary mechanism.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to hand over to Katherine. Katherine is going to give us a bit of an overview of the South Dunedin work and what we can learn from that as a practical example. Over to you, Katherine.
Thank you, Simon. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Katherine Cowper-Heays tōku ingoa. I'm going to give an overview of the work that I've been doing on South Dunedin. For those of you who don't know, South Dunedin is right down the bottom of the South Island of New Zealand. It's a stone's throw from the Dunedin city centre. It's home to around 13,500 people, 6,000 homes and properties, and a lot of amenities that serve the wider area. Lots of retail, schools. It's got about 45% of the city's playing fields because it's got a lot of flat land, and it's also got wonderful beaches and parks. It also has a relatively high population with disabilities and those in rental accommodation, and quite a few areas with a higher social deprivation index, but also some quite affluent suburbs as well. It's really low-lying with the harbour to the north and the open coast to the south, making it very exposed to a range of hazards, many of which are expected to worsen due to the effects of climate change. And so in response, Dunedin City Council and Otago Regional Council have established the South Dunedin Future Programme to respond to these hazards and to make an adaptation plan. So this all started around 2023, maybe a bit before, and one of the key drivers of the project was in response to severe flooding that hit South Dunedin in 2015. DCC and Otago Regional Council engaged Kia Pine, a consortium of WSP, Becker, G&T Connect and Tonkin and Taylor to provide technical services along the lines of engagement, risk assessment and adaptation planning. And we've been working together as a team over the last few years to deliver this project. We're currently developing a shortlist of pathways at the moment, which we'll take out to the community later next year. And we've also got Gemma Greenshields, who is leading the engagement, and Laura Robichaud leading the adaptation planning, and I was leading the risk assessment. So in South Dunedin, thinking about the information that we needed for the risk assessment, the hazard data is one of the first things required to set the risk assessment off on a strong foundation. So we went through a process of gathering the various hazard data across South Dunedin, aiming to get consistent data across the project area, and also considering the various hazards. So there were 6 different hazards that we needed data for, with varying levels of granularity and quality of assessment across those, and as well as that, considering the compounding hazards, so the interrelationship and interdependencies between some of the hazards in South Dunedin. So across multiple hazard data sets, we're likely to have different quality of granularity, different timeframes, scenarios, and this can make a multi-hazard assessment challenging and can require some judgment calls. Each hazard has their own complex science, along with limitations for use, and it's important to find a balance between finding a pragmatic solution to evaluate the risk while transparently conveying the limitations of a level of confidence in the assessment and the underlying hazard data. And for our assessment, we ended up adopting the approach to make the best use of available data. For the risk assessment, there's overlapping and inconsistent guidance around which approach should be used. And in that respect, the National Adaptation Framework points to some welcome developments around a standardised approach. But also, for each context, we need to be really clear on what it is we're trying to achieve. So part of making sense of the various approaches to risk assessment that are out there is being really clear on what your risk assessment is for. Is it comparative between places, say within a region, or as with South Dunedin, is it to provide an absolute level of risk? And in this case, having knowledge beyond large, infrequent 1 in 100 year events to more frequent events, say 10 or 5 year, can help with the understanding of risk at the community level, and that can then inform your risk tolerance and more closely align with level of tolerance around acceptable levels of risk that may directly inform adaptation planning of options and the level of service that we want to achieve. And finally, communication is key. So there's a need to communicate the risk assessment and the hazard data with the community, and understanding our stakeholders in that process is really important. So how we communicate depends very much on who the audience is, and each group of stakeholders will be very different and have different requirements and needs for what they need to know around the risk assessment. And so again, this comes back to really needing to be clear on our audience and who and what the risk assessment is for. So when the community is involved, being really sensitive to the context there around their needs. And for South Dunedin, this involved working with our specialists in community engagement. So what we did for South Dunedin, the first step was making sure we were really clear on what the risk assessment was for. We went through a process to really pin down who our stakeholders were, and then also being really clear on our objectives, which allowed us to think about what information was really needed and prioritise that without getting really caught up in the detail, which could be very complex. So through this process, we established 2 aims for our risk assessment. The first was to outline the case for change, and that was establishing a baseline risk profile for South Dunedin to illustrate the consequences of status quo or the do-nothing scenario. And the second was to support spatial adaptation planning, which was to inform where and when adaptation may be required to reduce risk, and establish a baseline against which potential risk mitigations could be assessed. This part of the assessment was more focused. It had a single stakeholder, which was the adaptation work stream. And so there we worked really closely with Laura to understand what information she would need in the adaptation planning decision-making, which allowed us to be really clear on what we needed to cover off as this part of the assessment. And so by being clear on our objectives, we ended up focusing a lot of attention on the aspects that were the most influential in evaluating the adaptation options. So for us, that involved working with stakeholders and asset managers, to subject matter experts, to understand the vulnerability of different elements to various hazards. And both that was both so that we could say what the baseline risk was at present and under future sea level in climate scenarios, but also so we could guide the future. So we could guide what level hazards should be maintained at in the future to keep the risk low to inform the adaptation options development. And so through that process, we established a risk assessment process that was repeatable and is being used to inform the adaptation options evaluation. So now we're at a stage where in parallel, the adaptation work stream has been developing and evaluating the adaptation responses through options, and they've been structured using the PARA framework: protect, accommodate, retreat, and avoid. So the options are developed in response to specific risks and hazards, and then we've brought combinations of those options together to develop potential futures, so that the options work together to respond to the multi-hazard and riskscape of South Dunedin. And this is what's shown on the images on the right-hand side, where we're at a point now where we're developing these shortlisted futures and pathways. So evaluating the futures requires us to think about how each option reduces risk. And we apply the same risk assessment as what was developed as the baseline. We can build that up with different layer of risk reduction to form an understanding of the risk within each future. And a problem here is that while we can confidently say what some options will reduce risk effectively within a given level of service, say we can build a seawall at the harbour side and there's already one there that works, and we can make it higher and quite confidently say that it will keep coastal inundation and erosion at bay. Whereas some of the other hazards or environments are more complex, and to know anything beyond a basic feasibility for those options, we would need to start to need to do more sophisticated analysis. So that means using models to predict the change in hazard. And in a lot of cases, while we know we can probably reduce risk to a desired level of service, the question starts to become, how much will it cost? And without the right level of analysis, this can be a very open-ended question. And there's also the problem that potential that we may shift the problem elsewhere. And that's another reason why you might need to have more detailed analysis or modelling to give you an understanding of how options might impact in upstream or downstream conditions. Say, for example, end wall effects around a seawall, where you can cause increased erosion at the end of the seawall as the coastal energy gets transferred along the wall. And so the point here is that there can be very varying levels of detail that you need in order to get an understanding of your various options to the right level of detail to inform your assessment and where you need to get to. So you might need to do more work to understand costs and impacts. And this can be on a case-by-case basis with the different options responding to the different hazards in different locations within your area. And then the last point, challenge around understanding our risk is just around residual risk. And so this is a really interesting concept, given that we're in a place with very highly uncertain climate projections, where the adaptation plans fit within clear timeframes and use climate scenarios. All of our options are designed to levels of service within these timeframes, except that the goalposts are still changing. And so some of the options involve really hard engineering solutions, such as raised land, which is very disruptive to the community. It has extremely high investment, and they're options that we could call high regrets. we need to be really confident that if, for example, we're raising land, we need to be sure that we're raising that to the right level, considering that we're still in a place with high uncertainty regarding how long and how hard the impacts of climate change will be. These are ones that probably require the closest level of examination and are possibly candidates for more complex analysis. Also, ones to keep monitoring as more information on climate change impacts become available. And again, that's not a very good answer around what you do in this case, but perhaps it's also just a plug for more conservative projections, really thinking about what timeframes and what we might do beyond 2100 or 2150 when we're designing these. And we're not quite there yet in South Dunedin regarding raising land, but it's just something that we're keeping in mind. And with that, I'll pass back over to Simon. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's see a big virtual round of applause, please, for Katherine. Brilliant, brilliant, fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to James. James is going to steer us through a practical approach and some frameworks for thinking about how we actually tackle the challenge of adaptation planning. So, James, over to you.
Kia ora, everyone. I want to follow on from Jonathan's presentation and Katherine's presentation by focusing on how we might create an adaptation plan and some specific things to consider. So I wanted to begin first by talking about this concept called the adaptation hot potato. And I was talking to someone yesterday about this concept, and it's effectively like kicking cans down the road. If you're a developer, your incentive is to build your development as quickly as you can and sell your property to make a profit. You're not worried about the hazard context necessarily or the long-term adaptation challenges that might present themselves. If you're a property owner, you will do everything in your interest not to have hazard information on your property file, given that that has potential to affect the value of your property. If you're an insurer, you're going to continue to insure until the risk gets so great that you're out of there and you stop insuring or you raise the premium significantly. So you can manage your risk at quite a short turnaround and on an annual basis even. So you've got your own incentives. And lastly, if you're a councillor, you are going to avoid making controversial, hard decisions, potentially that will affect your chances of getting re-elected in the future and causing, disquiet or controversy within the communities that you represent. So each of these parties, I believe, have got misaligned incentives. I think there's potential for them to be aligned, but that is our big challenge around adaptation: is how do you create process, incentives, provide information that enables all those players to act together as much as possible. So with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about the pillars that might constitute an adaptation plan. The first three are probably those that are more familiar to us when we think about adaptation. Those are: what process are we going to follow and the governance of that process? So that's the adaptation cycle. We're going to engage with communities. We're going to think about options and dynamic adaptive pathway processes, etc. We need data and analysis. We need to understand risks and hazards. There's uncertainty involved, and we might involve local knowledge and mātauranga, local iwi and hapu knowledge as well. And we will assess options, look at the feasibility of those. So that's all pretty well understood. What I believe people don't think enough about is the funding and who's going to pay for that, the compensation mechanisms and equity involved in those potential compensation mechanisms, both now and into the future, so intergenerationally. And lastly, any planning and legal implications of decisions that might be made, how they might be built and implemented, signals and triggers that might be more conceptual, tied to certain things that might play out over time, but are potentially difficult to embed within any legal or statutory environment. If we don't think about all of those together, those 6 pillars, and there are potentially others I haven't thought about, then we risk our adaptation plans not being effective or needing to be revisited over time. There's also a question around sequencing. Where do you start? What should you begin with first? When should you begin these types of processes? And also, particularly on numbers 2 and 3 on the screen there, the level of detail that we go into. I think that we could risk keeping things too high level, so we don't have enough detailed information. And conversely, as we were talking about with Katherine earlier, sometimes our risk assessment processes go, I believe, into too much detail. And what is the appropriate level of detail that we should go into? Now I want to just bring that kind of thinking about those, probably the first pillar around the adaptation cycle and the approach that we might use and engaging with communities. And I really like this model that I've found recently. And it talks about 2 axes and how we think about the level of certainty on the vertical axis. So at the bottom is where we've got close to certainty around the technical and the hazard context and the climate context versus the top of the axis where we're a long way from certainty. So a lot of uncertainty in the climate regime. And horizontally, we're talking about agreement within the stakeholders of the community. On the left, close to agreement, on the right, far from agreement. So the first quadrant is where we've got a lot of certainty around the issue and we're in close agreement. And that can be defined as a computational issue. And what the author means by that, and I think this is helpful, is that these are types of issues that we can address through analysis, through computation of options or assessment of options, and effectively implementing those. So relatively straightforward in terms of the agreement, the certainty, and how we might approach that. If we stay in that same bottom row, but we say we've got good certainty around the issue, but we are far from agreement, those are issues that might require bargaining. And what we mean by that is we have to reach agreement and we have to have mechanisms to come to agreement on how we approach this issue as a community. That might involve dealing with trade-offs. It might thinking about finding common ground and methods to understand the different points of view and finding common ground and ultimately cooperating on what those might be. The fourth one is where we are far from certainty. We don't really understand the issue well enough, but we might be in agreement on that level of uncertainty as a community. So those issues require judgment. And the types of approaches you could take in that situation are using experimentation, adaptive management. This is where your dynamic adaptive pathways might come in, and ultimately collaboration and working together as communities. The last quadrant is sort of the worst of both, where we're far from certainty and we're far from agreement. And the authors talk about this being an issue requiring inspiration. That's where we need leadership. We need reframing of the issue from sort of a negative context potentially to one of hope and inspiration. We need adaptive governance, and we need, again, collaboration as a community. So I really like these 4 quadrants that help us think about what is the context of the issues and the community that we're dealing with, and how might we approach these different issues. And a separate author I've referenced here has gone on to say, well, let's look at the 5 stages of adaptation planning in relation to those 4 quadrants. And if we look at the first 2 quadrants, sorry, the 1 and the 3, that's the computational issue and the issue require bargaining, you'll see that the analysis or the way to analyze potential futures is more through looking at climate change projections and models. Whereas if you're looking at the 2nd and the 4th pillars, where we've got judgment and inspiration, it is more around using tools like scenario planning, and this is where your dynamic adaptive pathways would come in. I think it's a useful way to frame things, and it might be something that you might want to explore as you're thinking about your own adaptation projects as you move forward. So in summary, I've got 3 kind of wrap-up comments I'd like to make when we're thinking about adaptation planning. Number 1, we need firstly, and I just want to reinforce that, I guess, that adaptation is ultimately a socio-ecological process anchored in place, and it requires an integrated response across, if you recall, those 6 pillars, those many interconnected issues, and we need to integrate all those. And we need to have tools to manage often the deep uncertainty that exists within those. So number one, tailor our process to the nature of the issue that we're dealing with. Number two, think about the appropriate, or I would say minimum level of technical or risk analysis that you need to undertake to move your project forward. And lastly, think ahead to other factors that could affect your adaptation project or your plan that are outside of those more technical areas. That could be the funding, the social issues, the political and legal issues that might arise. So thanks very much. I'm going to pass back to Simon, and we will continue the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James. That's fantastic. Look, we've got one more quick poll to gather your input. Clarity around roles and responsibilities is coming up number one. Clarity around funding and compensation protocols is coming up number two. Alison's chucked in 1, 3, and 4.
Yeah, interesting. So, yeah, roles and responsibility and funding and compensation is, and yeah. Interesting that those are getting the higher votes, I suppose, as kind of goes to the point around, you know, yes, the hazard and the hazard tools and platforms and the risk information is important, but these other things potentially trump that.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's there'll be some councils coming in very soon, I am sure. I am wondering, James, just if we look back in the history of human settlements, how have we done this in the past when we have had to adapt? In reality, what has actually happened? Have we done some assessment of that?
I mean, if you took a very deep time view of this, adaptation, adaptation is a problem because we found fossil fuels. And there are two reasons for that. One is because it's causing emissions. The other is that we built permanence using huge amounts of energy and machinery in place. So we've got concrete and steel and society and communities that are inherently unadaptable. There's nothing adaptable about how we've created society. So that's because of all the energy that's gone into building them. And now we're saying we've got to adapt these. So if you were talking about communities that were living in within the flows of their natural environment, adaptation wouldn't be a concept, because they would pick up and move with the changes of seasons. So we've created this problem ourselves, and hence it is. And the big kicker here is we've created all our wealth in our properties. We've created property values around that, and so
that's the challenge, right? That articulates the challenge really neatly, I think. Let's just go on. We've got a question here from Marie and a great little comment from Alison, but let's move to Marie. Marie, do you want to just pose that question to James? Let's mix up the voices a little.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, James. Thanks for your presentation, and everybody. It was awesome. One of the big hurdles that we are facing in local government is that huge emphasis on evidence-based decision, where always we are being asked more data, more evidence, when the minimal level of assessment would be kind of wisdom-based. So yeah, any practical advice would be welcome in how we can sell this idea. Cheers.
I mean, it's another, Jonathan and Katherine, you might have views as well. It's a really good question. I think we need an evidence base at some point to justify an intervention, especially obviously if you're in local government. But the knowledge and in Te Ao Māori traditional knowledge, mātauranga, I think plays a role there. I think there's also the piece around what decision are we trying to make? And Katherine's point, and I think it's worth elaborating on, if you are trying to say we've got 10, 20 communities on the coast, and our assessment is trying to say which one of those or ones of those communities are more at risk than another for the purposes of prioritising where you focus your efforts, then I think you can do that very simply, and you don't need to do a complex assessment. But I think there's misunderstanding around what is an assessment of risk or hazard, and what is the purpose of the assessment that we're trying to achieve. Is it for comparative prioritisation, or is it some form of detailed design of an intervention in place? And those, if you've got that clear, then I think you can tailor your approach to each of those. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thanks, James. We got any other questions coming in that people would like to ask? Feel free to put your hand up as well. If you don't fancy typing, just pop your hand up and we can go straight to you. Just have a quick look at what we got in the final results of the poll. Doesn't really change there, James, I think. I was just reflecting on, historic. I think, if I think about Warwick Castle, which is the most well-preserved and well-visited castle in the United Kingdom, or certainly in England, and you look at many other castles, they were just abandoned, whereas Warwick Castle has evolved with the time, as Ricky said. It's a story of human evolution and innovation. Castles were certainly a degree of permanence back in the day, more so than past sites, I guess, if you make a reference across different cultures, which were less permanent and perhaps changed hands more frequently. But do we have any other questions?
There's Jonathan, sorry, Simon, I'm just looking at the chat. There were discussion earlier about this idea of a resilience rating.
Yes.
Which is
Alison brought up about that's being used in Australia.
I understand the concept. I'm not familiar with them. Is anyone on the call, or Jonathan or Katherine, are you familiar with the?
Alison, I think, are you still on the call? Do you want to just quickly outline that? I noticed you posted a couple of thoughts on it. Alison, over to you.
It was something I was looking at when I was the principal advisor to the Building for Climate Change program at MB, which is looking at creating a potentially mandatory scheme where you'd have climate resilience ratings for houses, especially houses in higher moderate risk areas, and you could have a different rating for different timeframes, and that would allow buyers to potentially compare apples with apples and would incentivize people to invest in site-based adaptation improvements to their property, because if they did that, they could improve their rating and then get better insurance premiums or better deals with banks, and that is how it's playing out in Australia. They have an app-based system in Australia that started with a bushfire resilience module, and they've expanded it to be more comprehensive now. It's free, anyone can do it, it's not mandatory, but people who are in high-risk areas do it because they get better insurance premiums, or they can get insurance, whereas they might not have otherwise if they didn't have that rating. So it's a really effective way of providing good information to the market about the level of resilience of a particular property in a particular place. I don't necessarily think that's the be-all end-all of the solution in the climate adaptation space, but it would certainly help informed better market pricing that considers risk.
Yeah, it's a useful tool. I think New Zealand seems to have an aversion to rating tools. I know, Australia has the neighbours rating tool. It's got other rating tools that seem to be, people are very willing to accept and produce market signals, which was a question back to you, Jonathan. Maybe I would just ask Jonathan and James quickly to comment. Do you think that is something we could be using here to provide some sort of market signal or privilege, if you like, or preferential treatment? Jonathan?
Short answer, yes. I'm not familiar with the Australian model specifically, but I'm all in favour of having as much information as we can get and having tools that can help people understand the level of risk they face and how they can enhance the resilience of their properties. But we should bear in mind that many people can't actually do very much to affect the resilience of their specific properties, that resilience will depend on community level decisions, for example, protective structures that will protect a whole community from a flood. And we also have to bear in mind that many people can't afford to invest significant additional amounts in their property, raising the floor level or something, which may cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we just have to be very mindful that there are limitations in this context.
Thank you. And James, your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think also there's a piece here around risk-based pricing for insurance, which is not a rating, but it's also about, there's a view that that's going to become more and more common, that we're going to see risk-based pricing, which will, in theory, push insurance premiums up considerably. And that as a scenario, when we're talking about adaptation scenarios with communities, that your insurance could go up to X amount, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 a year, whatever it might be, looking at examples overseas, and what might drive that
that I think is an interesting piece to consider. But yeah, I think alongside these resilience ratings. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to just pass quickly to Katherine in one moment, but before we do that, I'm going to make a shameless plug, because one of the questions here, I think, is also how we fund some and finance some of these changes, the adaptation changes, the infrastructure. For any people who are interested to know more, we are hosting a panel event at Tonkin and Taylor on the 3rd of December with 2 bank representatives, the chief economist from Simplicity, Shamubil Yaqub, and Helen Mahoney from LGFA, to explore exactly that. How do we leverage more sustainable finance, so perhaps preferential rate finance, to fund infrastructure, and particularly looking at that combination there with new entities like InfraKiwi that are offering perhaps to be purchasers of that sort of infrastructure if it meets requisite standards, and there's a long-term solution. Katherine, just one comment here. We had Samuel. Let's close with this question. Did you see Samuel's question? Maybe you could just pose that and ask Katherine for that one, Samuel. Sam Chayadimana. Oh, and if not, I will do it. He has realized the need for localization of risk and the power that lies in us combining the scientific evidence-based approach with local citizen science to both ground truth, the science, and also fill the data gaps. I'd be interested in your reflections on that in the context of what we've learned from the South Dunedin Futures work.
Thanks, Simon. And yeah, that's right, Sam. I definitely agree that there's a magical combination there between the science and what's happening on the ground. I know in South Dunedin, it ended up being the conversations with the people within South Dunedin, the subject matter experts, the asset owners within council, the community that really that provided a lot of the really important substance of the risk assessment. So yeah, combine that with some solid hazard data, and that's probably the main things that you need.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Katherine.
Sorry, Simon, I was still trying to unmute myself, but yeah, I'm listening.
Hey, Sam, how are you?
For the answers. Good to see you, Simon, and thank you for the presentations. Really enjoyed them. Thanks for your answer, Katherine.
Thank you very much. Well, look, thank you very much. It's been an action-packed session. Jonathan, thank you very much indeed for making the time and lending your wisdom and experience to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Simon. Thank you.
Katherine, thank you so much. Lots to learn from that project. And thank you, Laura and Gemma, for stepping in and supporting. It's a team effort. We love that collaboration and dapping it, as they say, on the fly. And James, thank you very much indeed for sharing the practical thoughts around how we can start to conceptualize some of the thinking and frameworks that will actually get us to action, which is where we need to be, right, in making decisions and getting stuff done that lines up with the future we want. Back to Jonathan's point, what is the future that we really want? Let's work backwards from that and see if we can spend some money to get there. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're interested in the event that we have on the 3rd of December, please drop me lines. Limited seats in-house, but unlimited online. So thank you for joining us. Really cool session. And James, do you want to finish with your whakatauki just to sign us off?
Sure thing. I thought this was a really relevant one. Whatu naru naru te tangata toitu te whenua, which is, as man disappears from sight, the land remains. Kia ora, everyone, and have a great.
Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you.